So Games Workshop and I'm not sure what to really make of this. They just teased us, or they teased us in the newest community newsletter. And I have to say, it looks amazing. An amazing map of the old world, kind of updating it, adding some lore. And is this the reboot? We knew this was relaunching for a while. Warhammer Old World, a.k.a. Warhammer Fantasy, bringing that back to the tabletop. And I really have to kind of wonder, what's Games Workshop thinking, and what direction are they going to take this? That's what we're going to explore in this vlog. That's what we're going to push out there, because something is going to drop 2021. And in terms of the old world, in which I'm a massive fan of, I've got a massively huge goblin army. There are some things I'm interested in. There are some things I'm not interested in. And there are some things, Games Workshop, you burned us, you burned me. I'm not going back. And I know, like, I have poor impulse control when it comes to miniatures. And they put out some miniatures, and I'm like, I'm sold here, take my money. But Warhammer Fantasy is a completely different beast. So my first question was, and I'm going to kind of put it out there, push it out there for you guys, especially those of you who are old world supporters or old world enthusiasts. Games Workshop, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? You destroyed the old world. You blew it up with all this chaos stuff, end times. You nuked the entire system. You rebooted the entire system. You got essentially what was left of your Warhammer Fantasy base. Now, at the time, Warhammer Fantasy was not as big as 40K. If I just do a little unscientific crunching of the numbers here, being in the New York area, playing in Westchester in a number of clubs, going up to Connecticut to play, making it down to New York City to play, it was probably 5 or 6 to 1. 5 or 6 40K players to 1 fantasy player. But there was enough of a base. And there were numerous 40K players like myself. While Warhammer Fantasy was not my primary system, I dabbled in it enough. Now we're looking at the time frame. We're looking at a couple of years back. Even though there were less fantasy players, they on average spent more than the 40K players, because 40K at the time, while the armies were ramping up in size, Warhammer Fantasy was a mass combat, mass scale game. Even if you were playing Ogre Kingdoms, you had tons and tons of models, vampire counts, out of control. I was playing an old goblin army. I'm going to pull that out and show you guys if you want. Thousands of goblin miniatures. Thousands. It's insane. It is 1-to-1. We're not talking DBA, DBN, where I've got 5 Romans on a little stand and it represents a legion. Like, these are 1-to-1. It was crazy. So even though there were less players, they were spending a lot more. And it's not like they were playing old armies. As GW released stuff, they were keeping up with the models. So it was interesting. I disbelieve that there was no money in the old world. Not as much as 40K, not as popular. Maybe GW didn't need to support it as much, kind of dial it back and pump it into 40K. But to destroy the old world, especially on how they did it, they got all you to buy in on new books, on new stuff, end times, and Storm of Magic was kind of where I jumped off. I didn't buy into the end times, and then they nuked it. And then they said, okay, well, all of your armies could play in Age of Sigmar. I do appreciate that. I've never played Age of Sigmar with my goblins or Chaos Army or whatever you want to call it. And I've resisted Age of Sigmar simply because the player base around here has not been that steady, that constant. And being involved in 40K as my primary system, that's where I've played. So the old world goes away. And why did it go away? Was it a question of the rules? Yes, they were much older than 40K, and they were very much mass combat, rank and file. Some would say, the biggest complaint I heard about the old world and playing it was about positioning and getting the charge off. It was not a very dynamic game in terms of movement like 40K. Well, that makes sense. You're commanding, massive, massive armies, command and control. from what it was trying to accomplish of mass battles. It worked fantastically. And again, it was one-on-one. One miniature represents one miniature. So yes, it wasn't as dynamic as 40K with the movement, but that's like futuristic modern combat versus command and control, old-timey type combat. But I could see a number of players looking and saying, this takes too long, or it's tons and tons of positioning, then you get the charge off and you see what happens. But the big thing was, it just seems like Games Workshop pulled back, didn't support it. They killed it. They rolled everything into Age of Sigmar, updated the plastics, updated the play style. Essentially, it's 40K in fantasy times. And that's it for the old world. So now they're bringing it back. And I have to wonder, why are they bringing it back? The lore, I think, is very good. I enjoy the lore tremendously. I mean, I'm going to commit heresy right here. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition is one of my favorite games in how dynamic it is, and kind of the lore and the presentation of the old world, especially with how they handle magic. It's refreshing compared to Dungeons and Dragons, where everyone's just all blinged out with magic items. But if you have a magic sword in Warhammer Fantasy, that's a big deal, and magic is no baby cakes. Magic is a big deal. But there's nothing at this point, 2020, 2021, that's overly special about the old world. In many ways, if anything, that's very 80s. It's kind of, this idea has moved on. I mean, just look at the whole orc debate, where orcs being kind of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien-esque, early AD&D, to now, Warcraft, and how D&D has been just changed all of these traditional fantasy, I wouldn't even call them monsters, but now playable characters. And that's kind of interesting how they've done that. And I think that's a great idea to push forward from the perspective of more options to play. But default mode orcs bad doesn't really exist anymore. And for me, in many ways, Age of Sigmar kind of took this understanding of fantasy, mass consumption fantasy, which we have, and made it so that in true 40K style, look, there is no good or bad. Everyone's just kind of equally messed up in this crazy world with how they do it with space fascists and everything like that. So going back to the old world, Games Workshop, you literally have a vault full of lore, full of history, full of everything, but has the gaming culture moved beyond that? Who's really going to be interested? That's my first question. Who's really going to be interested in the old world outside of someone like myself, who had my genesis, my formulated early years, my gaming DNA set in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, set in that classic view of what the old world is. And even with that, and I'm very comfortable and I enjoy that, I've moved on from a lot of that. I've evolved, and I continue to want to evolve gaming-wise, and I want to explore new things. I want to be thrown on my head and be like, wow, look, I can play... Why can't I play an orc magic user and be penalized? Why can't I have this aspect in the game? So I wonder, you're going to reboot it, where's it going to go? Second to this, is it going to be rebooted, or third to this, the analogy of, we've got 40K, Warhammer 40K. We've got 30K too. A lot of 30K players playing a very, very specific time frame type game. And I would say in many ways 30K is a little bit more serious than 40K. Is the old world rebooted going to be a subset? Is it going to be kind of specialized? I won't say boxed games, but like we see with like Titanicus and other 40K snapshots. Is it going to be more Grimdark than the Grimdark? Is it going to be more Sigmar than the Sigmar? Is that what we're looking at? Where it's a very subset because they realize, look, Games Workshop, we've got all this IP, we've got all this time, we've got all the molds, the models, the lore. We got to make some money off this. We got to do something off this. So if they bring it back on that kind of very focused, I could possibly see that working. But I have to wonder, if they reboot it to now it's kind of a fourth prong. First prong is 40K, making cash. You look at the numbers, you look at what they report, Lord of the Rings brings in a lot. And I mean, I've been tempted to jump into Lord of the Rings numerous times. Then we've got Sigmar. Those are three prongs. If we're going to do fourth prong and bring in the old world, is it going to be enough of a leg to help inject cash into Games Workshop? Those of you who got burned and who played the old world, and I know there's a number of you who never left, a number of systems, I still play Mordheim, right? There are players out there that never left, but if you did leave, are you going to buy in after how Games Workshop did you dirty? Like, no, absolutely not. And are they going to support it? We don't know. Do you want to be a year or two in and then it just vanishes? Games Workshop has a track record of doing that. Blackstone Fortress, I love it. I play it. Amazing game. Oh, we're going to support it for years to come. Years to come. Bam! Killed it. Just like that. Done. Over. So, Silver Tower. Oh, we're going to support it for years. And I'm like, hey, I was really interested in Silver Tower, but I had to kind of clear through some other paint stuff first. But I'm like, it's all good. No rush, Silver Tower, because they're going to support it forever. Bam! Done. Canceled. Like, that's what Games Workshop does. So I'm very, very skeptical if they killed the entire line without rebooting it and they forcing you to jump into Age of Sigmar, forcing you to take your models and initially push to Age of Sigmar. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical. And on the opposite side, I wonder, new players, are you going to jump into kind of old world, classic AD&D 1970s, 1980s archetypes and play that? For better or for worse, we've moved on from that. Now, where I would be lining up to pre-order, take my cash, and pay Games Workshop prices, $180 for a box set when elsewhere would cost like $50. If they take the engine that they built, the gameplay engine that they built with Silver Tower, Hammerfall, Warhammer Quest, I don't want to say a Warhammer Quest old world fantasy reboot of Warhammer Quest, but if they ported that out where I could have that kind of advanced hero quest-esque feel of taking some classic adventurers, the barbarian, the dwarf, the elf, the wizard, the magic user, and fight some of these classic type monsters, I could really be interested in that. That if they did a subset box game of it, I would be all in on that, 100%. But I don't see that happening. You're not going to be releasing maps and teasing me about orcs and Bretonnians, and I just don't see it. I just don't see it. And I kind of wonder, we'll find out more about their motives, but I'm just curious. For those of you who played Long Live the Old World, who played in it, would this be enough to bring you back? Would you forgive? Forgive me. It's okay. I won't do it again. I promise. It's like that Henry Rollins song, Liar. Like, it's all good. Give me another chance. You going to let Games Workshop give you another chance? Come on. It's not a lot of money. Buy back in. Rebuy your miniatures, right? Or you like, no, absolutely not. And those of you who exist in the current fantasy type environment of Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy games, honestly, looking back at the old world, this kind of classic AD&D 1970s interpretation of what fantasy, horror, fantasy type is, I mean, would you buy into that? It's kind of very narrow. It's kind of very restricted. Your thoughts on it, and I guess, again, we'll see in 2021 because the hype train is starting to build. And when Games Workshop starts teasing this stuff out, usually that hype train builds for 3 to 6 months before a release. And this is not, 6 months from now, cue the Fritz vlog where it's like I bought into it. I have a very, very limited interest of what it is, but I am curious to see how it's going to play out and how it's going to shake out.